Israel's bloodthirsty terrorist and war criminal, wanted by the International Criminal Court, Benjamin Netanyahu, has done it again. This despicable man, backed by the rogue regimes of the West and slave Arab nations, has announced that he would not allow the entry of aid materials into Gaza unless Hamas release more hostages. Now, this is in violation of the existing ceasefire deal, under which Israeli terrorists were to completely withdraw from Gaza after the completion of the first phase of the ceasefire that ended this weekend. But as expected, war criminal Netanyahu has decided to not honor the ceasefire deal as he ordered the blockade of food, water, and medicines. Just look at the depravity of this terrorist. He did so just when Palestinians began to observe their holy month of Ramadan, a month of fasting from dawn to dusk. These Zionists are mentally ill, downright pathetic souls, and misfit to civilized society. And how did pro genocide Western propaganda outlets such as the BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, and Associated Press report this horrible development? They simply repeated the Israeli line with no reference, absolutely no reference to how this amounts to another episode of collective punishment by Israel and therefore a war crime. And the same propaganda outlets have been invoking international laws after Donald Trump and J.D. Vance gave a dressing down to Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy. When Zelensky, a white European and Jew, is humiliated by Trump, the rule based international order comes under threat. But when a rogue regime of settler colony of Israel, built on stolen land of Palestinians, uses food as weapons to punish over 2 million Arabs, the rule based international order is respected. No wonder I say that the Gaza tragedy has exposed the West and their so called claims on being civilized. Now let's look at some of the headlines. A headline by the BBC read: Israel blocks entry of all humanitarian aid into Gaza. That's it. No reference to violation of ceasefire deal or this being a war crime. And the same disgraceful British propaganda outlet funded by our tax money called License Fee recently pulled its documentary from iPlayer just because a child featuring in it was related to Hamas politician. Now, this is how New York Times reported. Israel halts all aid into Gaza as ceasefire expires. To understand the support for Israeli war crimes by New York Times, you have to see this headline, which it carried in March 2022 in relation to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Its headline then had read, How Russia is using Ukrainians' hunger as a weapon of war. Can you detect any hypocrisy here? Palestinian lawmaker Mustafa Barghouti sums up Israel's genocidal intent 2.0 very well.
So what Israel is offering is the following. Either you extend the first part of the ceasefire, give us back all our Israeli prisoners, and then we will reactivate the genocide and reactivate the war on you, or you don't do that and we will reactivate the war on you. So in both cases, whether they deliver the prisoners to them or they don't, Israel will continue the war. That is the problem. And that's why the Palestinian side is not stupid. The Palestinian side understands very clearly that the return of all Israeli prisoners has to be conditioned with two things: the total Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and a complete and guaranteed ceasefire, especially guaranteed by the international community, since Netanyahu is violating every agreement he can violate.
Mayrav, why?
What's heartening is that the Arab countries, with an exception of United Arab Emirates, have been unanimous in their condemnation of the latest development. Qatar, which has been a key country negotiating the ceasefire, reacted angrily and asked the global fraternity to stop Netanyahu from committing another round of genocide. A statement by the Foreign Ministry of Qatar read, and I quote, "The state of Qatar strongly condemns the Israeli occupation government's decision to halt the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza Strip, and considered it as a clear violation of the ceasefire agreement, international humanitarian law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, and all religious principles." The Ministry of Foreign Affairs emphasizes the state of Qatar's firm rejection of using food as a weapon of war and the deliberate starvation of civilians. It calls on the international community to hold Israel accountable and ensure the safe, continuous, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid to all areas of the Gaza Strip. The ministry reaffirms the state of Qatar's steadfast position in support of the just Palestinian cause and the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, including the establishment of an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. End quote. The Saudi Foreign Ministry said in a statement, and I quote, "The Ministry of Foreign Affairs expresses the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's condemnation and denunciation of the Israeli occupation government's decision to halt the access of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. The use of aid as a tool for extortion and collective punishment constitutes a blatant violation of international law and a direct infringement of the basis of international humanitarian law, especially in light of the humanitarian catastrophe facing the Palestinian people. The kingdom reiterates its call on the international community to put an end to these grave Israeli violations, activate international accountability mechanisms, and ensure the sustainable delivery of aid." End of quote. Foreign ministries of Jordan and Egypt too have issued similar statements condemning the Israeli move. British MP and former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn wrote, and I quote, "Israel has chosen to mark the first days of Ramadan by blocking humanitarian aid to Gaza. Still, our government refuses to implement sanctions and defend international law. There is no other way of putting it. This is a resumption of genocide, and our government is complicit." End quote. Francesca Albanese, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, the lady who first said that Israel was committing genocide last year, wrote, and I quote, "UK government leaders, past and present, have historically shielded Israel from accountability. This makes the UK as responsible as other states. In the time of genocide, though, the UK government has gone out of its way to deny, ignore, and in many ways support Israel's genocidal conduct. May accountability materialize soon." End quote. War criminal Netanyahu has called it a Witkoff plan, implying that he had the blessing of Trump's special envoy on the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. A lot will depend on how Witkoff reacts. But one thing is clear, as Daniel Levy recently told the United Nations Security Council, South Africa was globally ostracized for committing a lot fewer crimes than what Israeli terrorists have committed in Gaza and the occupied West Bank in the last 16 months.
Nor the name of Layla Al-Khatib, a 2-year-old Palestinian killed in her home in the occupied West Bank just days ago while eating dinner with her family, or 5-year-old Hind Rajab, bombed and denied medical attention, dead with her family. Those lost in the turned-off incubators of Al-Shifa Hospital. A minute of silence for each of the Bibas children would be appropriate, as would a minute of silence for each of the more than 18,000 Palestinian children murdered in Israel's devastation of Gaza. That silence would extend to over 300 hours. When Hamas is culpable, it is held accountable, sanctioned heavily. When an ambassador of a state stands at a UN podium with a little shredding machine and shreds the UN Charter, that's a gimmick. But when a state like Israel conducts itself in ways that render the Charter meaningless and which assault those conventions, including on genocide, rights, norms and laws that this body holds dear, then that is a challenge that cannot be allowed to pass. It is the kind of affront which decades ago led to apartheid South Africa being suspended from active participation at the UN.
The glaring hypocrisy of the West in implementing international law has brought us to a point where the same Western countries are now playing victims against Russia. If you support the rule of the strongest against Palestinians, you do not have the right to play victims when Trump and Russia use the same trick against Ukrainians. Period. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you too think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should consider becoming part of it. Details are there in the description of the video. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.